Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates, and this is Allen Ginsberg.
Long since the years, letters, songs, mantras, eyes, apartments, bellies kissed, and gray bridges walked across in mist. Now your brother's welfare's paid by state, now Lafcadio's home with mama, now you lie in New York beds with big poetic girls and go picket on the streets. I clang my finger cymbals in Havana, I lie with teenage boys afraid of the red police. I jack off in Cuban modern bathrooms. I ascend over the blue ocean in a jet plane. The mist hides the black synagogue. I will look for the golem. I will hide under the clock near my hotel. Its intermission for tales of Hoffman. My nostalgia for 19th century rides through my heart like the music of the Moldau. I'm still alone with long black beard and shining eyes, walking through night's dark, smoky tramcar streets, slowly past royal muscular statues on Karlovy Stone Bridge, over the river again today in Bruegel's wintry city. The snow is white on all the rooftops of Prague. Salute, beloved comrade, I'll send you my tears from Moscow.
That was message 2 from a reading Allen Ginsberg gave in London all those years ago in 1965. Ginsberg was one of the 20th century's most influential American poets and the founding father, high priest even, of the beat movement, and he became somewhat of a countercultural guru, possibly best known for his revolutionary poem, Howl. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night. Now, who better to talk about Ginsberg than his friend and biographer Barry Miles, known to his friends as Miles, the man who made that recording back in 1965, and the others we'll hear today courtesy of the British Library Sound Archive in the Ginsberg estate. Miles is the author of over 70 books, including biographies of Paul McCartney, Frank Zappa, John Lennon, William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, Bukowski and Allen Ginsberg, in addition to books on the Beatles, Pink Floyd and The Clash, as well as a definitive history of London's counterculture, London Calling, an epic work. In the 1960s, Miles worked at Better Books, where, in 1965, Ginsberg gave a reading that led to the International Poetry Incarnation, a seminal event co-organised by Miles, and following that he established the Indica Gallery, where John Lennon met Yoko Ono, and the Indica Bookshop. He brought McCartney into contact with people who wanted to start International Times, which McCartney helped fund. And I also heard that he was the first person to give McCartney a hash brownie. With John Hopkins and Dave Howson, he organised the 14-hour Technicolor Dream, which we've talked about before on this show. A concert in 1967 at Alexandra Palace to raise funds for International Times with poets, artists, musicians, Pink Floyd, Yoko Ono, Arthur Brown, Soft Machine, Tomorrow, The Pretty Things, and all sorts of other malarkey. Miles' books of memoirs of his time in the counterculture in the 60s and in the 70s and the upcoming in the 80s record his extraordinary adventures. In 1969, he moved with Sue, his then wife, to rural New York State, where he lived with Ginsberg on the Beat Farm, and that's what we're going to talk about today. That and some of his crazy times he spent subsequently at the Chelsea Hotel in New York. We also get into all sorts of other countercultural things: sex, drugs, rock and roll, poetry, pigs, Allen Ginsberg's beard, Buddhism, booze, and the beats. Welcome, Miles.
Hi there.
Listen, good to see you again, and we're going to dive deep into some of your adventures in the counterculture. Now, it's going to be difficult to squeeze it all into an hour, obviously, so right. I'm not even going to try. As you know, I've been reading and loving your book in the 70s, because I thought we would talk about your crazy life and times with Ginsberg on the farm. But before that, just a quick summary for a listener. So Miles, through the 60s, has come from, is it Cheltenham or Cirencester?
Born in Cheltenham, grew up in Cirencester, went to art college in Cheltenham.
Right, and then you came to London. You'd already been corresponding with William Burroughs and various other people.
Yeah.
You came to London and you sort of plunged pretty quickly into the heart of countercultural London. Throughout the 60s, Indica Bookshop, poetry happenings, writing for Oz, for IT, for the Underground Press. You've been basically fully immersed in that stuff. It got to sort of 1970.
Yeah.
And you were sort of like, you were kind of worn out,
well,
weren't you?
It wasn't just me. I think everybody I knew had reached... they were just totally exhausted. So many late nights, too many drugs, all kinds of unspecified diseases. I mean, so it was a time when people were retiring to communes in Wales and were going back to Australia or wherever it is they came from and sort of reassessing their lives. But
also you've been working like a mad thing as well, haven't you?
Yeah, the last year was crazy. I mean, I was also the label manager for Zapple, the Beatles experimental sort of spoken word label, basically, although it was going to have other kind of experimental stuff in it. So I've been making records as well as running the bookshop and writing for International Times. So I was just absolutely wiped out, really. And then in the end, the bookshop just closed.
Right, you were saying earlier, and I heard this rumour, it may not be true, but Indica, one of the reasons Indica, the countercultural bookshop, had to close was because the people kept nicking stuff, and because you were hippies, you wouldn't, you declined to report them to the police.
No,
so half the stock got stolen.
They knew that we would not obviously call the cops because I mean we had the cops in the shop before because they came to raid us once, took away a load of books. So no, the last thing I'm going to do. So they just ripped us off, and so it closed. It's a shame because. Obviously, it was the only place you could get certain things, particularly American magazines, little experimental magazines and stuff like that. And also, we did have a clientele that was a bit exceptional. I mean, there was one time when I was entertaining the editor of the Village Voice and the publisher of the Voice, and who were visiting London. And right in the middle of it, this huge Swedish guy dressed in handmade sort of leather and hand knitted stuff, with huge long hair all matted, literally leapt through the window, smashing it. There's glass everywhere. Grabbed a big armful of books and yelled, books should be free. And he went charging off down the street, handing out these books to startled passers-by, And I mean, these guys from New York, they said, "My God, all my years in New York, I've never seen anything like that."
And you were all too cool to go around and run after him and stop him, were you?
Well, you wouldn't want to stop him. He was completely out of it on something. I mean, and he was big, man. He was a big Swedish guy. He looked like a Viking.
So Indica was no more. Indica Gallery as well, sort of. That was.
Well, the gallery had closed earlier in '67, I guess, maybe even late '66. The gallery only lasted for 2 years, whereas the bookshop lasted for about 7. We closed on February 29th, 1970.
Right.
And we started at the end of '65, so it was a good long run. Really. Yeah. And International Times began in its basement, and Alex Trocchi had a little office there for Sigma, and it was very much a countercultural centre, really. And I was just so wiped out. And
Ginsberg, who was a friend of yours, become a friend of yours over the previous years. I think you said to me that he sort of recognised somehow that you were knackered, didn't he?
Well, he did. I mean, I first knew him in 1965. He stayed with me in London. It was from my flat, basically, that the ideas for the Albert Hall poetry reading came about, and then a meeting at the bookshop and so on. And then, so every time he came to London, he would stay with me. Not always, but most of the time, right through to the end of his life. And I later on, particularly in the 70s and early 80s, I would often stay at his place if I was in New York for any length of time. He became a very, very good friend. But mostly when I was living with him, on the farm, and then later on in Berkeley, because we shared a floor of a hippie commune in Berkeley in 1971. Right. So that was kind of fun as well. We'll probably get on.
We'll get onto that. Yeah. So he recognised that you were sort of, you needed basically some R&R, right? You needed a break from all this stuff.
Well, he'd set up this farm. It was called the Poetry Farm, and it was basically for poets, mainly poets, to dry out, really. It was Ray Bremser lived there, who was an old Beat generation poet from the 50s. who'd been a junkie at one point and was really not, very frail. Basically, his wife looked after him and did all the cooking and everything. She always did his share of everything. Gregory Corso was there for some time, and that was difficult because Gregory was in a bad shape, and he wasn't on heroin, but he'd been on it for many years, and he was desperate to get out of it, on booze.
He was desperate to get out of his head, or desperate to get off the booze.
No, he was desperate to just get as high as possible, right. By whatever it means. I mean, I don't know why he stayed there really, because he was so irritable and so unpleasant. And Alan even was saying, who's the most accommodating of people. He said, "I don't think there's any friendship left, Gregory. Like you've just used it all up."
I was quite surprised because I associate Gregory Corso, one of the original beat poets, and I've been sort of friends with Ginsberg for all that time. And
so since about 1953. Yeah.
I didn't realise that he was so out of it and had gone so bad. You were saying earlier that it was Burroughs that introduced him to heroin, right?
Well, they were both living in the Beat Hotel in Paris, and I mean, Bill was certainly on heroin at the time, and they were hanging out together a lot. But Bill was always quite open about the fact that it's very, very bad for you, and unless you have enough money, it's it'll fuck you up really, completely. I mean, you'll be robbing people and all the rest of it. On the other hand, Bill liked company when he was taking his drugs, and so Gregory got strung out.
Misery loves company, as they say. When you so your friends, and he's also recognised both your talents as a sort of chronicler, writer, and that you sort of need some rest. So he invites you to come to the States with the purpose of basically archiving his work.
Yes, because I'd made an album with him in the year before, 1969, of him singing William Blake that came out on MGM Records. And he'd enjoyed that experience, being in the studio. We had some good jazz musicians on there, and even Elvin Jones, in fact, played drums on one track. And so he knew that I knew enough about recording studios and tapes and all that to do a good job. So he invited me to catalogue his tape archive, and over the years he'd collected an enormous number of reel-to-reel tapes of his readings, and sometimes they were taken off air. A lot of them were in terrible fidelity; couldn't really be fixed. But so we had hundreds of them, and the idea was to select the best reading of each of his published poems, and almost all of them had been read aloud. There were about 8 or 10 that hadn't, and sometimes there were up to 25, 30 versions of them. So it was a lot of work.
Yeah. So the idea was that you come to the farm, you get your head together, and then of course with Sue, your wife at the time, you went there together, and you could do that archiving whilst you're there.
Well, there was one problem, of course. I mean, I arrived on the farm, and Alan had forgotten to tell me that there was no electricity. There I was carrying my Revox A77, but there was no way of playing anything.
He hadn't thought that through.
He hadn't thought that through. So the first thing we had to do was send away to the Whole Earth Catalogue, one of those addresses on the Whole Earth Catalogue, and get a kit to build a AC/DC generator. And then we built a windmill. I mean, I say we. I did very little of the actual hard work. Gordon Ball, who ran the farm, did most of the heavy slog.
Okay,
and
right.
Peter Orlovsky, who was a big muscular guy.
Right. So Orlovsky, another beat poet, another going back to the early days, right, as well. So he was there too.
And his catatonic brother was there. They took him out of the mental hospital, and Julius was there as well.
Right, and Orlovsky and Ginsberg, this sort of on-off relationship, right?
Well, Peter was living there with his girlfriend, Denise Mercedes. Right. And Alan used to hang out with them a little bit, but basically I don't think there was much in the way of sex anymore. So basically Alan, although he pretended to like Denise, he really would have been much happier if she was not there.
It's all very accommodating and quite free and easy. They had a relationship, but Alan was okay with it that Peter was there with his girlfriend now, and everybody's getting on, at least on the surface, right? And it was quite a liberated time, wasn't it? I mean, not just in terms of like sexual liberation, but in terms of emotional relationships, quite mature in a way, wasn't it?
Well, yes, it was at that point. But I think in the end, that's probably what wore Peter down. I mean,
okay.
But see, Peter came from a very dysfunctional family. Every single member of his family, including his mother, was in a mental hospital at one point. And he had there was the twins, Lafcadio and Maria, and and his older brother, Julius, and they'd all spent time in hospital. Peter was the sort of sanest of them. Poor Julius, I mean, you had to tell him to do everything. You know, you'd just say, have some breakfast, Julie, I need to have breakfast. And of course, everybody who came down said, have your breakfast. So he'd have like 3 breakfasts.
Or he'd just do what he was told?
He just did what he was told. He didn't say anything. He never said a word.
Never said a word?
No.
Right.
I mean, you could give him pills which were so powerful you could almost see smoke coming out of his ears, you know. And then he would revert back to when he was last sort of more or less sane, which was back in the 50s sometime, and he would sing sort of old Guy Mitchell records and stuff. And what I really liked doing with him was playing cards, because you never knew what the rules were, and he'd be dealing them out, and it would all be very complicated. And in the end, he, just as you thought, well, maybe, you know, something's, you know, he would just fold them all up and say, I won. Well, he didn't say I won, he just waved them. He didn't say anything.
Cheered, stood up and cheered.
Yeah, and then he would indicate whether I would like another game or not. Well, why not?
Why not? Right, yeah, of course. It sounds great. So I was going to say earlier, when you said you built the windmill, you were more of a kind of academic type. I didn't see you in a pair of dungarees and
no,
up on the hill wielding a large hammer.
Crushed velvet loon pants, kind of left over from the 60s.
But a windmill got built, which provided some sort of intermittent
because
power supply.
They'd already dug a well, so they had a water supply that they cleverly invented. And because there was the shaft going down to the spring, we built the windmill above the shaft, and then put the car batteries, down below the frost line, right deep down in the shaft. So, and then run power cables up to the house.
Right. So the wind would when the wind blew, it would charge up the batteries.
Yeah. So there were about 8, I think, maybe car batteries there.
And it was a bit intermittent, was it? Because I mean, we
only really had about 3 hours power a day.
So you were trying to archive and edit, I'm assuming, as well. Edit with these tape machines and cut and splice and find the best bits and put it all together. On a few hours a day.
And then there were other people there, of course. I remember one of Alan's on-off girlfriends showed up, and of course she would insist on. She had brought a record player with her, so when we weren't in, she'd use up all the power just playing
records. Right. Did you manage to keep your temper?
No. She was totally selfish. She never thought about anybody else at all.
I mean, it's a combination of the sort of bucolic and, you know, this wonderful place, upstate, right, and, you know, beautiful farm.
Oh, it was surrounded by state woods. And it was about 90 acres, I think. There was a cow and a horse, right. and then one day we got a pig. We went to get some spare parts for one of the cars. All the cars were like 1950s sort of Oldsmobiles and stuff. I mean, absolutely astonishing that they were still going at all. But Peter Orlovsky and Denise and I went to buy a new fender or a new exhaust or something, to this automobile graveyard. Basically, it was just like fields of these old wrecks. But also in running around there were chickens and pigs. And Peter, of course, decided to buy a pig. So this guy just stuck it in a sack. It was just a little piglet. And,
was this for the purpose of eating it or as a pet?
No, as a pet. As a pet. No, it was a vegetarian farm. Strictly vegetarian. Okay. Yeah. And I remember Alan's face when we got home, we were getting the stuff out of the car, and Peter just opens the top of the sack, and this pig shot in the air. I mean, it must have covered about 8 feet before it landed, you know. And Alan just held his head in his hands and sort of moaned, you know, like, oh no. You know, like,
I've got to say, he comes across as an extremely lovely person, Ginsberg, certainly in your account anyway, because, you know, he too has had this kind of crazy 60s. He's become a celebrity, a guru, isn't he? And a countercultural guru. He's, you know, it's a time when...
He wanted to be, yes.
He wanted to be. Yes, okay. But he's been a poet since the Beat era, elder statesman of the Beat generation, and you know, he's got into mysticism and all that stuff, and this is a time when, you know, poetry readings were like rock concerts, weren't they? So, you know, and he's obviously made quite a bit of money, and he's got his place in
He never made any money. He gave he made a point of putting all his money into a charitable trust, the Committee on Poetry, and on the strength of that, he kept people like Corso, Herbert Huncke, Harry Smith and all kinds of other people going, and anyone who was in trouble, he would write a check. When International Times was busted, for instance, he wrote us a check for $500 or something.
Right.
So he made sure that he had no money left. Each year his own living costs were absolutely minimal. Really, he lived in a really dangerous part of the Lower East Side.
Yeah.
He dressed entirely from thrift shops.
Yeah.
He was about the most non-materialistic.
He was really truly living it, wasn't he? Because obviously he was generating quite a lot of money from his appearances and his writings and etc. And then so he puts it into the trust. The trust owns the farm, and the farm is this kind of poetry farm. That's the idea, isn't it? But also he basically offers it as a kind of countercultural version of Priory or something, isn't it? Where his kind of countercultural friends can come to get off drugs and dry out.
Kerouac was going to go there,
right?
But he didn't, of course. And
to dry out.
To dry out, yeah. But of course he died. Well, he just died an alcoholic's death in 1969. So I never met Kerouac. It's the only one I didn't meet.
Right.
Yeah.
Presumably he could see that drugs and booze were killing his friends' creativity and in fact them, right? Was that why he did this thing of actually setting up this place where they could come, and he tried to impose sort of quite strict rules, didn't he?
Oh yeah, there was no alcohol, no drugs at all, not even pot, and yet he certainly didn't disapprove of pot. He was a founder member of LEMAR, a legalized marijuana movement in New York. There's a lot of wonderful pictures of him on a demonstration in the late 60s carrying deep snow. There's hardly anyone around at all, and he's marching along with this great big sign saying, "Pot is fun." Absolute classic Allen.
Well, so he didn't have any moral. It wasn't a moral objection. It was just that he could see that it wasn't doing people good, right? So
it's like Howell, it's all the best minds of my generation destroyed, blah, 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 blah. And it's true. An awful lot of his friends really didn't survive or really fucked themselves up so badly mentally that they didn't produce any work anymore.
Right.
Anything of any interest.
Right.
So he wanted Kerouac to be there, and they certainly wanted Gregory to dry out, and any other. lots and lots of poets came and stayed. You name them, they were there. Everybody from Robert Creeley to Hunky came up. I remember he was there.
Who was he then? I don't
know. Herbert Hunky was a thief who was so bad that even the police on Times Square used to hate him and throw him off the square from time to time
for prostitution. Or
yeah, he was a male hustler, but mainly he was just a thief. He would you couldn't. No matter how down and out you were, he would still rob you. He was just absolutely no scruples or no morality at all. And of course, on the farm, I remember very shortly after he got there, I found him in my room, and he said, "I got lost." It wasn't that big a farm, I'll tell you. He's the one who named the beats.
Right.
The actual term "beat generation" came from him.
And so he was regarded as... Was he also a poet then, or was he just regarded as a beat character in some way?
One of those kind of characters. These were all white middle-class guys, after all, and they met a genuine down and out. Except he wasn't, of course. He came from a middle-class family in Chicago. But his father threw him out when he found him dressed in women's clothes or something, and he became a male hustler. And he survived. In the end, Allen kept trying to persuade him to write about some of his friends, and he wrote quite serviceable prose, and the stories were also great. So there's 3 or 4 books of his out.
Right. Okay.
He's long dead, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
But
so I suppose he was like a beat character in some way, like authentic, low life. Kerouac's books are full of those sort of people. Aren't
they? He's in there. He's in On the Road, I think.
Okay.
Certainly in one of the, maybe 2.
Allen Ginsberg set up this farm, which is also kind of run as a commune, even though I think you say in the book that it was a commune, but it was kind of his place, and he sort of set down the rules, right?
Well, yeah, he set down the rules, and he also paid for it. It cost him a lot of money, I think. Because it was producing stuff, but it wasn't. There were so many extravagances. Like the horse, for instance. Nobody ever rode it, and nobody ever groomed it. So there were great tufts of hair floating around everywhere, and and people would love to go and stroke its nose and chat to it. But I don't think Alan ever got on it. Or maybe Peter did occasionally. There was this pig which grew to be 450 pounds in the end, turned absolutely enormous, and still tried to sleep on their bed because it lived in the room with them.
Oh God!
There was a whole bunch of chickens which periodically got eaten, of course, by by foxes and stuff. I don't think we had. I think yes, they did have a goat. I think we had our own milk. Yeah, we had some goat's milk, and Bessie the cow, of course, and she was milked every day, and so it was self-sufficient in that. Peter grew acres of soybeans and things like that, and so much of that was, since we were vegetarian. I mean, I guess most of the food actually was okay.
Yeah, I think you said, didn't you, that when he was coming off junk, he had all this energy, and he sort of poured it into kind of farming and cultivating vegetables and stuff. And then there's this rather beautiful passage when you talk about getting ready for winter, because obviously it was hot in summer, wasn't it?
Very
the
hot.
winter was super cold, and then there's this. You spent this whole time towards the end, don't you, where you're all pickling vegetables and preparing for putting the winter stores aside. I mean, it all does sound almost quite 19th century. Yeah. But meanwhile, Ginsberg is, apart from receiving people and just running the place or whatever, he's writing he's a ferocious writer, isn't he? He's writing poems. He's campaigning the whole time, isn't he?
Endlessly. Yeah.
I mean, he was a busy guy.
Because the Vietnam War was going, and he was writing endless things for the New York Times. I mean, in the op-ed column, and just inside the front door, I mean, when you came in, you came straight into the kitchen, basically. That's where the phone was. And there was a child's chair there, just this tiny little chair. And Alan sat on that virtually every morning. Why he never didn't get a proper chair. I mean, there's another chair just across the room he could have used. But and he sat there furiously dialing and talking to people, and he once got straight through to Kissinger at one point.
Really?
Yeah, and he said, "It's Allen Ginsberg, the poet," and Kissinger said, "I know,"
because Kissinger was one of the architects of the Vietnam War. Right?
He was.
Yeah,
he was. He was the Secretary of State. He was responsible for invading Cambodia and all the rest of it.
So he's kind of countercultural enemy in some respects.
But the fact that Alan was famous enough to even be able to get through, I mean, I can't imagine how many layers separate the average person from Henry Kissinger.
You've been tasked with this rather Sisyphean job of archiving Ginsberg's vast collection of tapes and stuff, whilst operating on the sort of a couple of hours electricity a day, which other people keep stealing to play Jimi Hendrix records and stuff. That's it. So how are you getting on with it? I mean, what was your day like then?
There was no work schedule, really. I mean, the schedule depended on how much electricity there was. And so I did other things. I was one of the main cooks, because the food they cooked there was awful. And Sue, my wife, when she was first there, obviously took over the cooking because she was a professional chef back in London. And but then when she...
Right, so the food, presumably the standard of food when you guys arrived... increased massively, didn't it? Right,
yes. I mean, the basic stuff was great. I mean, the beautiful tomatoes and things like that. But then murdered by a bunch of out-of-it hippies, really. Or beatniks, actually. They're all beatniks. They weren't not much in the way of hippie there. A friend of mine worked for Knopf in New York, and I asked her to send me the Art of French Cooking in 2 volumes by Julia Child. And so I cooked my way through all the vegetarian things there, and that's how I learned to cook. And I'm a bit of a foodie even now.
Right, I know that. But I mean, so one of the things, I suppose, which is slightly missing from that account is that you and Sue, who'd been together all the way through the 60s pretty much, hadn't you? You come to Ginsberg's farm and you split up, didn't you, whilst you were there?
Yeah.
So that must have been a very difficult one for you as well at the time.
Well, it was. It was. On the other hand, we got together when we were both teenagers. Basically, we grew up together, as you do. There was a lot of shared experience, and but if you get together with somebody when you're only, what was she? She must have been 17, I guess, and I was 18. It's very young for a lifelong relationship.
And you did all these things together.
And also, it was the 60s. Don't forget.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
so it was a slightly open marriage. It wasn't not that much really, not compared to many other people, but. We both had other little scenes, but then on the farm, the big problems came out, whatever they were, and she ran off with one of the engineers at the Apostolic recording studios in New York.
Right.
But she and I remained friends throughout her life. She's dead now, sadly.
Yeah. So you guys split up, and then you also get together with Anne, who became your wife later, all during this time at the farm, right?
On the farm, yeah. I was reading a lot, and there was a very big library there. Alan had a lot of books there. So I read a tremendous amount there. And and talked. You see, I mean, the thing about all these old beats is that they were great raconteurs. And there was the guy who ran the farm manager, Gordon Ball, was also a sort of experimental filmmaker, and he'd worked with Jonas Mekas and Barbara Rubin and all those people at the New York Film Co-op. And so he was very au fait with a lot of the avant-garde stuff, and so I became very good friends with him. And the only one that was really hard to deal with was Gregory.
Quite aggressive, right?
And he was aggressive, yeah.
Wanted to kill Allen at one point, didn't he?
Well, he was always saying how he was going to kill Allen. Yes, I mean that's one of the reasons Allen just got to dislike him in the end. But he also, I mean, he was trying to pressure Gordon into buying beer for him and stuff like that, and he knew that he wouldn't. But in the end, I was there once when he slugged poor old Gordon, just whacked him in the eye and knocked him across the room. And I tried to stop the fight, and I got thrown across the room. Fortunately, my glasses didn't get broken.
So it did seem to.
So it was a bit nasty sometimes.
Yeah, it seemed to ricochet from these kind of quite violent, difficult times with difficult characters, sort of strung out on coming down. Or Allen seems to have had a kind of quite a long fuse. He seemed to have been very patient with these people because he had a lot of loyalty to them, didn't he? Going back down the years, and sort of took a lot of shit.
Oh, he did. His friend, as far as he was concerned, all his friends were geniuses, and he almost single-handedly invented the Beat Generation. After all, I mean, because their work was really quite disparate, and they weren't even a generation. I mean, Burroughs was born in 1914, after all, and Allen was 26, and I think Gregory was even younger. So I mean, they were hardly a generation.
Allen gets invited to do various poetry readings in the area, and there's this one particular event, isn't there, where you've got a new recording machine as well, so you decide that you're going to go and record him live. I like this story when you went to this Catholic school, and he reads this poem. It's quite rude.
Well, it's a poem called "Please Master." Yeah, I do remember it, and it's classic of Allen that this is not something that was normally in his repertoire, but he read a couple of normal ones to the. It was at a school, so it was so all these schoolgirls sitting there with a nun sitting at the end of each row. And then he launches into "Please Master," which is "Please Master, fuck me in the ass," and do this, and I mean really hardcore stuff.
What got me is that afterwards the teacher came up to him and didn't say anything about the fact that he said "Please Master, fuck me in the ass," but had objected to the fact that he'd mentioned the Sacred Heart.
Yes, yes, I couldn't believe it because it was a liberal, Catholic college, but not that liberal. I mean,
I mean, so in a way, it all sounds quite mad and quite lovely at times and quite crazy at times. And then you got there, did you? You managed to actually complete the archiving, did you?
Yeah, no, I did. It took about, I don't know how many months. Probably about only 3 months when I think of it. Maybe 4. 4 is probably more like it. And we assembled a master tape, and then went to. I forget now why we couldn't go until the next year, but it wasn't until 1971 we went to Berkeley, because we did a deal, or Allen did a deal with Fantasy Records, who were doing very, very well at that point with Creedence Clearwater Revival, and making a huge amount of money, and they'd built a big new studio complex, and they weren't renting it out to anybody else, so there was studio space almost all the time. So we were going to do a 10-volume album box set of Allen's poetry, and at a special discount, and so we went out there to master it, because they had a Neumann cutting lathe and all kinds of really good stuff, which they were very hard to find. I mean, there was only one in Britain, and Apple Records had that. And so
you went out there to produce it.
Well, I basically produced it. I mean, in as much as I did, I remixed everything. Well, I mean, these were terrible tapes. Some of them going right back to the late 50s on paper. There was some on paper. I didn't even know that paper tape existed. I spent ages messing around with, and these are the days with cutting blocks and razor blades, of course. We're not talking anything electronic here. It's all very, very physical. And so it's just me with headphones moving tapes backwards and forwards to get the... Because often Alan also wanted any flubs to be taken out, where he stumbled over a word or somebody coughed or a dog barks or something. And sometimes we left it in, but if it really interrupted the flow of the poems, I used to edit that out. So that was what I was doing mostly on the farm, really, was once we decided on a good copy, I would then take the tapes back to New York.
Well, let's have a listen to something. We heard Message 2 from a recording you made in 1965 and was released on your and Hoppy's Love label. This is another from the same session on the same album. It's Big Beat.
The Olympics have descended into the red velvet basement theaters of Centrum. Long, long hair over those skeleton boys, thin black ties and pale, handsome cheeks, and screams when the applause rises to ecstasy, and this new generation of buttocks and eyes and tender nipples clap thousand-handed in great ancient rhythm, because the body moves again, the body dances again, the body sings again, the body screams newborn after war, infants cursed with cold jails and the secret deaths of the 50s, now girls with new breasts and striplings with the soft golden hair of puberty. Screams, 1,000 voices at once, 5 minutes long, saluting the meat god of the 20th century that moves through the theater like the secret rhythm of the belly in orgasm. Kolki, resurrected Christ, Maitreya, at last grim Kronos weeps tired into the saxophone. The earth is saved. Next number, she's a woman on the red electric guitar, and Ganymede emerges, stomping his feet for joy on the stage, and bows to the ground and weeping gives. Oh, the power of the god on his throne, surrounded by a battery of white drums, with his right hand sceptered, beating constantly into the brass cymbals.
So in Berkeley, you were living in a commune together as well, were you?
But in Berkeley, by the time we got to Berkeley, he was a doctor, and his wife, and then there was about 6 other people living there, and then we had a whole floor. And Alan fell in love with a guy, one of the coquettes, anyway. So there was this bunch of guys who did performance art and sang songs, and all in full drag, except they had beards, and which were all covered in sort of glitter dust. And Alan said, that glitter dust, it gets everywhere. He said, it's all over the bed, it gets up your arse, it's like in other places, So Hibiscus, his name was, that's right. So Hibiscus would be around the place.
Hibiscus, what a name, right?
Wonderful.
Great.
It may not have been his real name, you never know. Yeah, so the coquettes were pretty good. They've now become rather legendary, but at the time no one really knew who the hell they were, really. And they were pretty outrageous, even for Berkeley. And then Alan met up with the guy who became his guru, Chogyam Trungpa, who was a Tibetan.
Who was here as a based in Scotland, wasn't he, for a while?
He lived in Scotland for a long time. He had a British passport, in fact. Yeah, he started the Samyaling monastery in Scotland.
And is that how Ginsberg fully got into Buddhism then, Tibetan Buddhism?
Yeah. It wasn't until 1971. Right. And I'd known Trungpa from London. Right. And then Trungpa told him he should cut his beard off because he was scaring people. So Alan shaved his beard off, and he didn't look good without a beard.
The beard look was good, wasn't it? It was quite strong, wasn't it? Yeah,
well, it made him look like Karl Marx. And then as he got older and more distinguished, he shaved it into a nice shape, and he looked just like V.I. Lenin. So he didn't ever get to the Trotsky phase.
The hair for Trotsky. So just to go back a sec, so between the farm and Berkeley, you'd gone back to New York, and actually, again, it's a very vivid description because you get back compared with the bucolic nature of the farm, because you virtually, as soon as you get back there with Anne, you go in and stay in Alan's apartment in Alphabet City, and immediately get kind of mugged.
Yeah, there was no lock on the front door of the building. and we were up on the second floor, I guess. And I was just putting the key in the door of the apartment, and somebody just tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around and looked straight down the barrel of a gun. And then I saw that Anne was being held against the wall with a knife. And these two guys just made them take me into the apartment, and they tied us up, cut the phone wire off, and used the phone line to tie us both up. I mean, in a way, I was pleased they tied Anne up, because otherwise they might have raped her or something. And they kept saying, "Where's the money? Where's the money?" And I kept saying, "Would I be living here if I had it?" And they understood that. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So anyway, they took all the tape recorders.
Took your tape recorders?
They took the tape. Yeah, well, fortunately, only one of them had a tape in it.
Right.
So that went forever. But that was a euro 4,000. That was quite an expensive thing. Bob Dylan had given it to Allen, in fact. So Allen was quite upset to lose that.
Sure.
It's also a very expensive machine. Although very...
so that was quite a brutal reawakening, isn't it? Into the,
I was really scared. They piled a lot of stuff up, but they only did the one thing, obviously. They carried out whatever they could. The TV that they took didn't work anyway. And there was money there, in fact, but there were also about 6,000 books. They would not have found it.
You stashed the money between the pages.
Well, the little bit that I had. But yes, I mean, we're talking about $100 or something. But yeah. So I immediately, it took ages to get loose, and then I ran and banged on the next door, and this poor Puerto Rican woman, she said, "I've been mugged 17 times." She said, "Those boys, they only live round the corner on Avenue D, and it'll all have gone by now."
Right, they've sold all the
yeah,
gear.
They're just junkies.
But that leads us really to your. I think your first sojourn in the Chelsea Hotel, or maybe your second. You'd actually...
No, I'd been there before.
You'd been there before.
When I was making the William Blake album with Alan, I lived there. In fact, when I'd lived there twice before already. And of course, as soon as I got mugged, I mean, I was not going to stick around. I was back in the Chelsea.
So you and Anne rushed up to the Chelsea.
I got a cab and went.
It's punctuated, isn't it, this time, late 60s through the 70s, with your stays in the Chelsea.
Yeah.
And... what was it like? I mean, it was a strange place. I mean, it doesn't sound like any hotel.
To me, it was, I think, the happiest times, or some of the happiest times I've ever had my whole life were there. It was
what they call a residential hotel, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they did do what they called transients. When I was there, I think you had to stay at least 2 nights. But mostly it was people with a lease, who'd been there for years and years and years. And
so it was basically like having an apartment, but with a bit of room service, was it?
Yeah.
And a concierge, yeah.
Yes, the maids would come and change your linen and stuff and clean the place. And there was still the El Quixote restaurant next door, bar and restaurant. You could still get to it from the lobby. And a lot of people lived there. I mean, Virgil Thomson, the composer who did 2 operas, was Gertrude Stein. He lived there for about 30 years before he died. He died there. Yeah, he was like a sort of Mr. Magoo kind of character. He was little round. Everything was round about him, and he sort of bubbled, and couldn't wait to tell you all the stories of all the famous people he knew.
He also said Ginsberg introduced you, didn't he? And didn't he negotiate your rent as well?
Yes, he did. Well, he was paying
it because
I was doing the tape stuff still. Right. Yeah. And yes, I was doing a lot of the editing actually there, also because I didn't finish it during this. When I was over there to record spoken word stuff in the summer of '69, Alan, I said I need to find a hotel, and he said I know just the place, and I'd not heard of the Chelsea at that time, so he took me over there, and I remember we walked into the lobby, which was covered floor to ceiling with art. And I recognised a lot of it. There was a big Larry Rivers, and these are serious people, really good stuff.
Donated to the hotel, or
well, in lieu of rent.
In lieu of rent,
yeah.
Right, yeah.
I mean, Roscoe, in fact, had a studio there, but there were no Roscoes on the wall. I think Stanley Bard, who owned the place, took that home. So I hope he did. And the first person we ran into was Arthur Miller. So, oh, great. So Alan knew him, of course, because Alan knew everybody. And Miller, in fact, was no longer living there. But when he broke up with Marilyn Monroe, he moved in there, and he lived there for quite a few years. And he was just visiting for some reason, and that was nice. I thought, this looks a good place.
This is good.
Yeah.
Just for Arthur Miller.
And so then, he introduces me to Stanley Bart. There were a couple of different people behind reception, and then next to reception was the switchboard with Josie, and Josie really ran the building because you could call down to Josie and say, "Is anyone having a party?" And she knew who you knew because she'd plugged everybody in always, because it was in the old days that's how it was with the switchboard. Right. There was no direct dial, Right. So she would say, "Oh well, now Dr. Johnson, she's having a party this evening, and I'm sure you'll be welcome," because she knew that I knew Dr. Johnson. Who was this wonderful black woman who had taught literature at Columbia, and she had wonderful parties. I mean, it was really sort of the Harlem intellectuals coming down and meeting up with people like Mailer, and everybody would always be there. So those kind of parties were great.
So Miles, you must have been in heaven, right? So
it was great.
You turn up at this place.
Great.
The first person you meet there's Arthur Miller. Then and Ginsberg negotiates you a room, does he, with Stanley, the owner?
Yeah, I forget how much it was now. I think it was $320 a month. I think something like that, dollars. It was not cheap, but
right. And you had like a little apartment.
Well, just a big studio.
You going to parties with Norman Mailer and?
Well, the people who lived there was extraordinary. I mean, there was Arthur C. Clarke was still there with his telescope, which. He couldn't see any stars, but as he pointed out, he said that the things you can see, he said, it's better than anything you pay good money for in Times Square, and he just was looking at people's apartments, watching everybody having sex. And who else was there? Leonard Cohen was living there at the time, and he just had one album out, and he was one of the most generous people I've ever met, really, because people from the Chelsea would all gather in El Quixote next door, the big bar next door, and you'd often have a table of about 8-10 people ordering drinks and stuff, and sort of trying to keep track of who owed what and everything, and almost inevitably Leonard would leave the table early, and you'd find that he'd paid the whole lot.
Pay the bill.
Yeah, and he wasn't that rich. He'd only had one album out. I don't think his first album made him that much money. And then there was Janis Joplin was living there, and sadly I'm not one of the many conquests she made, but I did just occasionally close the bar with her, and the bar didn't close till 4 a.m. So we.
She'd be there right to the end, I'm assuming.
Yeah, we'd both be sitting there at the bar, not in great shape. So.
The project to archive all his poems, 10 albums set and all that stuff, and then you went on, you were good friends all the way through till he died, weren't you? And he'd stay with you when he came here. I mean, I think you showed me a picture of him naked in your flat, actually. Was that because his preferred means of dress was naked, wasn't it?
Well, the picture I showed you, that was his 39th birthday party, I think. Yeah, the Beatles came. And he was naked. That was in '65. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And John Lennon and Cynthia and George Harrison and Patty came to the party, and Alan was by then naked with his underpants on top of his head and a "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging around his dick.
Was that the first time you met the Beatles?
And that was the first time I met the Beatles. Yeah,
they must have been impressed.
Well, Lennon stayed around for a little bit, and then they both stayed around for a bit. But the first thing they did was look around to make sure there were no photographers around. Right. Of course, because they're quite canny. Then they stayed for a drink and then went to leave. And I said to John, why are you going so soon? And he says, "You don't do that in front of the birds." And then, of course, a couple of years later, there he is, stark naked on the front of Two Virgins with Yoko,
But you stayed kind of tight, didn't you, all the way through? And then,
no, because he did. Yeah, when he stayed with me here, he would, we would just hang out. I mean, there were certain. He loved Soho, for instance. We would go to the French pub and places like that, and he always loved it. He always thought it was great.
Right, and as the 70s progressed, I mean, he got deep into Tibetan Buddhism, didn't he?
Yeah,
and that was a big thing for him for a while and stuff. He became an elder statesman, didn't he? Of sort of literary elder statesman. Of some sort.
Yeah, and because by then I was writing my biography of him, which took 3.5 years.
Right, an epic work as well, right? Yeah.
It was my first proper book, and so it took me longer than it would now, let's say. It was also a bit of a hagiography, let's face it.
In what sense?
Well, because I suppose I was just too close to the subject. I mean, to me, the ideal biography is one where you don't pronounce on anything. You let the reader decide. Good God, this man's a monster, or what a saint. Alan only wanted to change stuff about his guru. I mean, he never wanted to. There was no indication at all that I should I mean, a lot of the stuff I write about, a lot of people will find quite shocking, or did find quite shocking. It came out ages ago. But as far as Allen was concerned, it was just his relationship to his guru, and that I worked on quite a bit with him.
He didn't want his guru to be misrepresented in some way,
exactly.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, in fact, he just wanted him to be all light and sunbeams. Yeah.
Which is weird because I know his guru was a
absolute sexual predator, massive cocaine habit, and all the rest of it. Yeah. And he wasn't even from Tibet, of course. He came from
is that right?
came from Kamdo, which is in China and always has been. Although culturally it's Tibetan Buddhism, it's actually in China.
Right.
And his autobiography, of course, is called Born in Tibet. So,
right.
so from the first word, it's a lie.
That's quite funny. Boy! You were able to get the truth of Ginsberg into between the pages of the book. And
yeah.
We live in these sort of very sensitive, touchy times, don't we? Where a lot of those countercultural figures, their behaviour now they'd probably get them cancelled, wouldn't they?
God! Also, probably put him in jail. Actually,
right.
half of them. When you think of the way people like Kerouac and Burroughs behaved, underage prostitutes in Mexico City and everything. Well, Kerouac particularly was the girls. Burroughs liked, he just wanted to have a boyfriend, He was usually around 16, 17, 18. And he was monogamous, basically.
Right.
I mean, that was just a function, like drinking. You drink to get drunk, you get a boy and you pay them £5 a day or whatever it is, and they're there for years in some cases. Whereas... I mean, Allen never did that, actually. He was never a sexual tourist. But he certainly came on pretty damn strong to his students. He believed, I don't know whether he believed it or he just said it, that, the Greek tradition of sleeping with your students and all that. So I think a lot of what he used to do would get him into a lot of trouble. And he only ever once tried to come on to me as well, so that he just asked and I said no. So that was the end of it, really.
Was that on the farm or?
No, it was at the Hotel Chelsea when I was living there. His problem sexually was that he only really liked straight men, and that's hard, because straight men usually like women.
Peter Orlovsky, I think you said he was largely straight, wasn't he, really?
Peter told me that, in order to have sex with Allen, he had to imagine Allen was a woman, and that goes right back to the early 50s. But I think Allen was never really happy, really.
Right.
I mean, he had some very, very good times, but when I was working on the annotated edition of Howl, I think he really enjoyed coming over. He would call up and say, anything we need, for dinner and stuff, and it was like a family, Finally, he had
a family, right?
Yeah, somebody who wanted to hear what he'd been doing that day and hear all his gossip and stuff, and would be cooking and have a nice meal, and it was great. And then we would work through till about 2 or 3 in the morning because he was a very late night worker.
Because I suppose he never had that. I mean, he did have relationships with women, didn't he? But
they were crazy. The ones who did have relationships with, they weren't going to be cooking for him. You could be sure of that.
So he came on to you once, and it was just a fairly transactional. Do you fancy it, Miles? And you were like, no. And he was like, okay, fine, let's get on with some work. It was just pretty much like that, was it?
Well, we were in bed together
okay.
because his apartment had been overrun by bed bugs, and it was about 2 in the morning, and he didn't know what else to do, and he didn't want to go to a hotel. So he said, can I come over to Chelsea? I don't think it was a come on either, because he wrote lots of poems, as he usually does. Anything that happens to him, bed bugs and stuff. There was a genuine bed bug infestation, and all his bedding had to be burned, and the mattress had to be thrown away and everything. Yeah, it was a genuine.
Right. So he turned that into a poem.
Well, he was good at doing that. I mean, the time he got mugged, for instance, which was during the same period, some Puerto Rican kids dragged him into an empty basement just a few doors from where he lived, and robbed him. And he kept chanting, om, om. And they said, stop saying, we will kill you if you don't stop that, because it was so irritating. And it could be as well. Right. And so he lost $60, and then he wrote a poem about it and sold it to the New York Times and made, I don't know, 400 or something. So it's absolutely classic.
Oh, great. Okay, good. The countercultural enterprising.
Yep. He was good at that. Yeah. See, Allen worked originally in market research. He was in the Empire State Building in an advertising company when he was just out of Columbia. He had a background in marketing and promoting. And that was how he was able to promote people like Kerouac and Burroughs and everybody so much, because he knew just how to manipulate the press. He'd been trained in it.
Poetry for him obviously was, the centre of his creativity, but also this rather other regarding duty that he had to his friends, often who were sort of disasters and obviously and often quite horrible to him, or kind of needy or living off him. There's not that many people who are so, generous to promote other people's work as well as their own. I mean, that was an unusual characteristic.
He was unusual like that. In fact, that's something I should have made more of in the book, but I didn't. No, he really, really believed that these people were all geniuses, and that was the first time in his life he'd met people like that, really, because his family was, really dysfunctional. His poor mother, she heard voices and, got completely manic and finished up in mental hospital. Alan sadly had to sign the thing giving her a lobotomy at one point, which he always regretted.
Sure.
I forget why his father couldn't do it. It was obviously a reason.
I know. I mean, that poetry could change society, right? And the more people read it or listened to it or heard it, that it would have a sort of transformatory effect in the culture. Right?
And also, Alan was very aware that as far as he was concerned, poetry was the premier art form. To him, that was the only thing speaking the truth in the McCarthy era, because we have to remember, America was very, very right-wing at the time.
And of course, Howell, is about the state of America, isn't it? And his work, he was a sort of voice speaking truth in the darkness, wasn't he? Quite often, or
and he even comes out there as gay in that poem.
Right.
And this is in 1955. He wrote it. 56 it was published. That was incredibly brave of him.
And for you, when you read or heard Howell as a young man back in Gloucestershire, what was that like to hear it then?
Oh, I mean, it was amazing. I read it in 1959, I think. I was obviously just a teenager. I was about 16.
If you think back to that summer, going into the fall on Ginsberg's farm, and I guess is it a happy memory for you? Is it a vivid memory still?
Oh yeah. Well, I was just together with Anne at that point. So yeah, it was very nice, being with a new woman and spending a lot of time talking to Alan.
And just to wrap up, so what happened to them? So Anne's still alive. She's
Anne is a Tibetan Buddhist,
with
a Tibetan name, living outside Boston.
Right.
Somewhere.
And Corso,
he's in the cemetery in Rome.
Right.
Next to Shelley, very close to Shelley.
Peter Orlovsky?
Peter is, I don't know where he's buried. He's dead too. Some years ago. They're all dead, actually, all the Beats. Ferlinghetti was the last one to go, and he only went some years ago. Alan is dead.
You knew Ginsberg as a friend. You caught him as a biographer as well, and also you archived his works. Knew him sort of inside and out, as it were. Didn't you? What was it like when he died then?
Well, it was pretty bad, really. I mean, I was in France, in the south, in the Pyrenees, and he called up and said that they reckoned he had about 2 or 3 weeks to live, because it came really as a surprise, this the diagnosis of liver cancer, and in fact he went into a coma the very next day, and died the day after.
Right.
So he called up and we talked for about an hour and a quarter or something, and it was a classic Alan conversation. I mean, it was on the one hand he was talking about his approach to death, and when he heard that he was dying, and it was absolutely certain, he said, I breathed a sigh of relief. He said, finally, it's over.
Yes. He meant that?
Yeah, he did. He said the same to a number of other people. To Burroughs, Bill told me that he said the same to him on the phone.
So it's a response to his physical deterioration, not like I've had enough of life here.
No, I don't think it was enough of life. I think finally the body was packing in, and it wasn't even his lifestyle. Not that Alan really took very many drugs, actually. He was never into that. He was too busy. He was working his ass off all the time, as well as saying really profound, moving things like that. I mean, he was still furnishing his new loft. He just bought a loft, and he said, I managed to get the Salvation Army to combine the delivery charges from 3 different branches. So I saved $28.
Don't worry about it. It's too late for that. It's too late.
God. I loved Alan. He was a wonderful guy. I mean, he wanted to just have a Buddhist funeral in Boulder, but I think some of his relatives got hold of him, and he had a Jewish thing anyway, up by the airport.
You're still here, Miles? I mean, in the 70s, we didn't get onto the second part of it, with Patti Smith and the punk era. And maybe we can get you back sometimes to talk about it.
It would be a pleasure. Good.
Thank you so much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture to talk about some of your adventures in the counterculture.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Miles. He really is amazingly modest considering all he's done. We did a William Burroughs in London exhibition with him a couple of years back, and he's great fun, as I'm sure you can tell from that conversation, such a sweetie. We've got to get him back to share some more of his amazing stories. I want to thank the British Library Sound Archive, and in particular Stephen Cleary, the curator of theatrical recordings there, and to Peter Hale of the Ginsberg estate for very kindly giving us permission to use them. And thanks to you, dear listener. Will you do me a favour? Come over to bureauoflostculture.com. Help support us in any way you can. You can join our mailing list, subscribe, tell your friends, leave a review, buy me a drink, write to us. We love to hear from countercultural friends. See you down the road.